I just have one more question, and then maybe others would want to ask. More than 80% of Americans identify themselves as middle class, if you ask them, even though many of those who put that designation on themselves are just one layoff, one health crisis, one emergency away from poverty. But because the middle class doesn't identify with poverty, and in fact, I think that they find some comfort in identifying with not poor. And we really need for people to be able to have an identification with the crisis in order to build the public will. Do you think that it's really time to stop using the language of poverty and find new language?
That's interesting. So my safe answer, and this will be the one that I stick to, is that only public opinion research will tell you that. And there are ways to structure survey instruments to actually test multiple framings of the issue and see what works with different constituencies. Mm-hmm. You may find, as a result of conducting public opinion research, that that poverty word just ain't working for the average consumer, if that is a target audience that you really want to be able to speak to and move. Mm-hmm. You may find that it is very helpful to policymakers, especially at the federal level, who are comfortable with that word, understand what it means and all the data points that come under it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not so sure about the use of the word. I would say, though, that my gut, based on other work that we've done in the social sector, is that there really does need to be a fresh examination of how we explain that narrative that you talked about earlier. I've never heard it really described quite that way, but you know, it's sort of, people, some terms are loaded. Mm-hmm. And some people think they have an understanding of an issue when they don't. And sometimes you don't need to remind them that they don't know. You just need to present something and make them think that they've got a new aha moment that is motivating.
That's actually what we've started doing at PolicyLink. We certainly use the term poverty, but when we're trying to paint a picture of where we want to go, we talk about building a society in which everybody can participate and everybody can prosper. And in order to do that, we have to address many obstacles along the way. One of those is people who are living in poverty, but it also includes issues that have to do with middle-class people who are vulnerable to losing their home, so that we can go along the continuum. Well, thank you so much.
Great. It's been great.
Thank you, ladies. So now we want to open it up to you guys to ask some questions of our two panelists around this issue of political will and communications.
I'm sure we've been provocative enough to cause some trouble.
I think it's on.
Nicole Ravnow with the Southern Institute, and Gloria, we were the National Program Office for Covering Kids and Families that you all did the marketing campaign for Back to School, and one of the issues was this language around federal poverty level, and 200% of the federal poverty level, 100% of federal poverty level, and that was language that we were used to using in the nonprofit world and communicating with our peers. But when we rolled out the Business Council, it wasn't meaningful to them. First of all, that's based on family size, and they don't deal in families, they just deal in their worker. They pay their worker a salary, and it's not connected to whether or not they have children. What other work have you all done in terms of communicating to the general population outside of using that sort of federal poverty level theme and have to go through, well, it changes based on your family size?
I appreciate that question, especially because it's born out of your own personal experience of working on a national campaign like that. I would say two things. One of the best examples of us having to navigate that very complicated terrain had to do with a related campaign, which was to raise awareness so that families who were eligible for S-chip were applying. And the public opinion research that we did before we launched that campaign proved very telling. because what we found is that, one, many, many millions of people who were eligible to get healthcare support and Medicaid were not applying because when they saw the messages coming either from the federal government or the philanthropic community, they assumed that those folks were not talking to them because they don't see themselves
That's right.
as needful of resources to which they are entitled. And so, did we launch a campaign to explain to people that even though you think you're middle class, you're not, and therefore you ought to enroll for SCHIP? No. We developed a campaign that told them that we were talking to them by creating images that looked like them. And as you talk about race, always the elephant in the kitchen, what we found was that there were substantial numbers of people who were white, who automatically assumed that they were not eligible. So that meant that we had to create ads that showed them themselves, in addition to, obviously, people of color who should be taking advantage of the campaign, of the resources that were available. So that's sort of the second part of the answer, which is the way that we address the challenge is to be tactical and to meet people where they are. One of the things that we've learned through the years is that if you want to galvanize action, advocacy or consumer, it's never helpful to try to convert people through advertising or messaging in a way that you really think is going to be transformative. It's just not practical. We ain't got that kind of time or resources to make it happen. What we have found works well is to understand the mindset of the target audience, to meet them where they are and then bring them to the places where they can get more rich, contextualized information that is therefore helpful later on. And I think a lot of that insight is born of our experience as a firm that started doing political advertising. That still is just one very small part of what we do now. But we learned long ago that, you know, our evaluation measure, I know this room is very tentative to that, is how many elections you win or lose, and by how many points, and how much have you moved the opinion needle and all of that other stuff. And so it is sort of woven into our way of thinking, and I am suggesting that it should be for you too, that you are always thinking strategically about how you're going to get that tangible outcome. What emotional triggers or messaging can you use to just get them to go to the website where they can get that other information, and then hopefully have an action step that will allow you as a sponsoring organization to register to opinion leaders and stakeholders that they're out there. And so let me just sort of make this plug, and I think it's related to a lot of what I've heard talked about before and some of the questions you were asking. Sometimes communications is helpful to get people to do something, to go to a website, to sign a petition, to let their congressman know and all that other stuff. Sometimes outreach is done to raise sensitivity to an issue, and I think that's where this whole notion of sustained public will is critical, because there are really sort of moments where we can take advantage of big developments, but we've got to be sort of pushing that drumbeat all the time so that when Katrina happens, we're not starting from ground zero, where a legislative staff person hasn't even had to think about these poverty issues or housing or transportation or anything. They've already started becoming sensitized to it so that when there is a huge need, you can sort of capture that moment and get action. But I also am saying that constructive and strategic communications also has the benefit of being able to say, hello, we're out here, there are people who care. So that when you go into your senator's office and talk about what your organization is doing, you're not just providing all of the expert advice that you've got, but you're able to say, you know, we've got a constituency of how many hundreds of thousands of people who are signing up, you know, to hear my blog, you know, to read my blog, or to